Hello again and welcome to TiCME, Time Critical Medical Education. Today's tutorial is part 2 of the Decisions, Errors and Cognition series. Remember that in part 1 we talked about the different ways that we think. So this tutorial is all about errors, and what I'm going to do is use lots of examples from the non-medical popular science literature again, and hopefully provide those examples and relate them back to what we do at work. It's a really interesting tutorial, this one, so I hope you enjoy it. Alright, before we start, another Pat Cross-Carey article from Annals in 2003. Complexity of behaviour. What sort of activities do we do usually at work? Well, there's the ones that are very skill-based, and that might be suturing up someone, putting in a cannula, putting a tube in, for example. There's rule-based things. Good examples of that would be the Canadian C-spine rules or the Wells score for PE. And then there's knowledge-based activities, which are a bit more challenging because that's the clinical decision-making and diagnostic reasoning, putting things together, the synthesis. So I've told you about those activities for a reason, and it's because the sorts of errors that we make relate to the sorts of activities we're doing. So if we look here at this table, again from Cross-Carey's article, procedural errors, they're very visible. People see you do them, you notice them. You've got a high awareness of them, and they're usually recorded. So you can imagine that if you caused a great big pneumothorax when you were putting in that central line in resus bay with 20 other people there, the patient suddenly gets worse. That's the temporality of the side effect to the event. It's fairly highly medical, that mistake you've made. Everyone's familiar with it. You train so you don't cause a pneumothorax, and the good thing about these errors is they are preventable because training helps, and you can specifically target avoiding pneumothorax with a skill such as ultrasound for insertion. They are amenable to root cause analysis. If we look at the cognitive sorts of errors, and these are the errors of thinking, these are not visible. People usually don't notice them happen. Why? Well, the way your thoughts aren't on view for the whole resus bay, and no one's next to you when you're taking the history or putting together your notes. No one's watching and listening, and in fact, you don't usually notice that you've made an error either. Therefore, the errors aren't usually recorded. It makes them really hard to relate to the bad outcome. The medical nature of these aren't as high, but the trouble is that the preventability is much more difficult. Now, you can prevent these sorts of errors through training, but you can see that it takes a lot more in the background to help prevent cognitive errors, i.e. talking about cognition, before you can get to recognize that you might have made these. Now, the affective errors are the errors of emotion, and those again are sometimes visible and sometimes recorded. And if you think of a busy resuscitation bay when someone absolutely loses it, starts shouting, everything falls apart. Now, those sorts of errors that happen because of that sort of affective response are a bit more noticeable. But if you were in a bad mood because you didn't sleep last night, you had a fight with your partner before you came to work, people might notice, but it's very difficult to know that you might not be making good decisions because of the mood that you're in. Because of that, you've got low awareness. They're usually not recorded. Again, as a large amount of time goes from when you make your error to when something bad might happen to your patient, there's very low familiarity in that people really don't know about these sorts of errors at all. Again, they're preventable, and I'm certainly aware of an institution that people have to record the mood they're in when they arrive at work so their colleagues know. And the root cause analysis is possible but extremely difficult. Right, so diagnostic errors typically reflect multiple root causes. We're not going to talk about the procedural sort of errors anymore because I think those ones are pretty simple. Training, SIMS, etc. are the way to fix them. But diagnostic errors reflect root causes, and in fact, Graeber's study in 2005 showed that an average of 6 root causes were to blame for each diagnostic error. And roughly 2/3 of these root causes had system-related factors. So, not just individuals, but the whole system's at fault. 2/3 of the root causes also involved cognitive elements, and most commonly, although we might have gathered the data, we certainly didn't synthesize it properly. This is probably the main error that you see with your inexperienced staff. They're not really sure what to ask, and then they have trouble putting it all together. When you get more senior, however, not knowing enough is usually not the problem. It's usually, again, not joining the dots properly. You can reduce the system and cognitive errors with education, and that's what we're going to talk about in tutorial 3 of this series. Okay, we're going to just quickly mention some of the very specific errors that happen, particularly in critical care environments. So, how about this one? Everybody has seen a fundamental attribution error at work, i.e. the label is put on pre-hospital or from your colleague or from, the ambulance triage from the GP. For example, non-specific chest pain. It's very hard to separate that label from the reality of the situation if you prejudge and you go in there with an idea of what you expect. Classic ones are things like drug seeker or frequent flyer that get put on patients as a label, and very hard then to see their presenting complaint objectively. We all have to work better at avoiding this one. There's this anchoring and premature diagnostic closure, which personally I think is the most common avoidable cognitive error of the junior staff. Maybe not so much when you get more senior, but it certainly still happens. So this is fixating on a certain diagnosis early in the piece. That's anchoring. The trouble with anchoring, for example, you're thinking, well, this guy, he's got some chest pain, it's probably ischemic, he's 60, he's got risk factors. The questions you ask if you label and anchor early might be, so, is your chest pain tight, mate? Yep. Okay, so radiating to your arm. Okay, do you feel sweaty or short of breath? Yep, okay, no problems at all. Right, we'll just move on. You close off early then from the anchoring, that's the premature diagnostic closure. You might not ask very much more of the history, and you might do a very cursory exam, because whoever found something on examination of note in someone with ischemic heart disease? The trouble is, if you didn't ask the open questions, you might not have heard the symptom, which changes your thinking to make you think, actually, this person's got a dissection, and if I listened closely, I would have heard the aortic regurgitation murmur, which would have almost proved the diagnosis. Search satisficing. This is a good one, and this happens to me on busy shifts. Particularly, you notice this happening at handover, where everyone's had a good go at finding out what's wrong. There's been bloods, there's been imaging, there might have been a review from another team. The patient's still got their symptom, you don't really know what's going on, but everyone's, including yourself, say, look, but we've done the CT and the bloods, and the renal reg has had a look, and look, he's still short of breath, but he's not too bad, so we're going to let him go home. This one's a hard one to avoid. You do have to ask yourself objectively whether you are closing off the diagnostic process because it's as far as you can go, or because you have got a little bit bored and maybe you're a bit challenged because you don't know what's going on yet. Diagnostic momentum's a good one. This is classic in EDs where there's lots of handovers. Happens between the ED and the wards, happens between the ED and the GP referrals. So inheriting someone else's thinking. And sometimes what I do to try and avoid this one is when I've got a resident and they say, look, I've got a really difficult patient, I really don't know what's going on, often I might say, look, just stop there, just give me some very basic details and I'll go and see them myself. And I'll try not to listen to the full story, so I can see what another objective look does to the diagnostic process. Effective errors we've mentioned, and these are the ones that are very difficult, but they are avoidable, so we all have to watch the way we're feeling while we're at work as well. Authority gradients are great, and I'd like you to think about your own workplace and wonder if you've ever been in a situation where just because someone's more senior, the wrong things happen because no one stood up to them. I'm going to talk a fair bit about this in terms of communication a little bit later on. And then there's the failure to implement the forcing strategies. Now, this is errors which happen because you know what you're supposed to do, but you just haven't done it. Classic example is the drunk guy who's bumped his head in the middle of the night, and you know you're supposed to make him stay and get the CT scan, but he's like, mate, I'm just going to go home. I'll be right. I'll catch a cab with my mate. You let him go because you're busy, and this is when the bad outcomes happen. Alright, so first of the fantastic books to read, Malcolm Gladwell, excellent investigative journalist who's got a science bent, I think a bit of psychology degree in his background as well, puts together anecdotes and vignettes to make a sort of global point and does it in a very entertaining fashion. So Outliers is about who succeeds, i.e. who are the outliers, the top 1%, top 0.1%, and why do they succeed. So to learn about success, you often have to learn a bit about failure. So I'm just going to talk briefly about plane crashes and how that relates to our work. So like bad outcomes, plane crashes are an accumulation of minor difficulties and seemingly trivial malfunctions. Typically the weather is poor. Overwhelmingly, the plane is behind schedule, so the pilots are hurrying. In half of the plane crashes, the pilots are tired, and in nearly half, 2 pilots have not flown together before. Now, I always think when I see this of my colleague Dr. Elliott, I think you've all probably read the book The Checklist or heard about it. People from the aviation industry saying medicine would be a lot safer if we just were a little bit more like pilots who have to check everything off before they do anything. And I remember Dr. Elliott used to always say, well, imagine the checklist in a tertiary ED on a Monday. Right, so, alright everyone, is everyone on board? There's only supposed to be 200 of you, but we've got 350 and you're hanging out the windows. Alright. What's the weather like? Weather's terrible, boss. It's snowing and there's 100-kilometre-hour winds. There's no visibility. Right, okay. Where's Daryl, the co-pilot? Oh, he's called in sick, sorry. We've got this other bloke. He's not worked here before. He's not flown, but he'll sit next to you. Okay. What about the engines? Yeah, good news. Left engine's working great. Right engine, not so flash. Okay, alright. Well, we've gone through the checklist and we can't take off. Sorry, it's an emergency department. Got to keep cracking on. I always thought that was a pretty funny little story. Alright, so the typical plane crash involves 7 consecutive human errors, which are usually errors of teamwork and communication, not knowledge and skill. Heard that before. Remember the Graeber study that showed that diagnostic errors had typically 6 root causes? Emergency departments, as we've already said, and I'm sure intensive care units as well, are always running late or have bad weather, i.e. we're overcrowded. And we often work with staff we've never met before, in situations we haven't experienced before. Anyone turned up in the first week of the year to a trauma code? 15 people rock down, nobody knows who anybody else is. Right, next we're going to talk about cultural factors, and there's this fantastic measure called the Power Distance Index, which is essentially a measure of people's attitudes to hierarchy. So to what extent do lower ranked members of your organisation accept and expect that power is distributed unequally? Or do power holders have privileges? Or are older people respected and feared? There's a ranking of the PDI for each country. Australia ranks fairly low. America's moderately low. Countries that are very high would include North Korea, for example. I guarantee you that within your own hospital you could pick some of the departments which have a high PDI and some of the departments which have a low PDI. I'd like to think that my emergency department's pretty low We use each other's first names. We don't tend to wear suits. We tend to be on a first name basis with everyone from the cleaning staff to the consultant staff. So hopefully our PDI is low, but you never know. So power distance index, when you apply it to pilots, interestingly, the highest PDIs were in Brazil, South Korea, Morocco, Mexico and the Philippines, which matches very closely with the top 5 countries for plane crashes. Now, Korean Air is the case study in outliers, and it had a loss rate 18 times higher than that of comparable airlines until they said, look, enough's enough, this is very embarrassing. If we want to be a world player, we have to get our airline safety up to an international standard. So they brought in some outside consultants, and one of them came to change communication, i.e. the PDI. And they did that, and it now has one of the best safety records in the world. Interestingly, when you look at mountaineering stats, and now deaths are reported from New Zealand, from the Colorado Rockies, from sure the French Alps and everywhere else, and you are more likely to die in a mountaineering accident if you have got a single person of high experience and a lot of people of not very much experience than you are if you have just a group of people who are inexperienced. And the reason for that, they think, is because you are much more likely to push yourself into a situation where you cannot get out of it when you trust one person implicitly, i.e. there is a big power distance index, and maybe you didn't speak up to that person and say, look, I think I'm getting out of my comfort zone here. Whereas everyone's at the same level, people are much more likely to say, look, mate, I'm not going over that ridge. And maybe 3 other people in the group say, look, me neither, it's all a bit scary. So what else can we learn from plane crashes? All a bit morbid, I know, but has anyone ever seen an airway go wrong? That's probably the definition of a plane crash. Mitigated speech is great. Mitigated speech is the way people couch the real message of what they're trying to say in some sort of long, boring speech, or use language which isn't really to the point. Did you get what I just did then? I just tried to do mitigated speech to explain it. Sorry about that. Alright, so here's an example. This is a black box flight recording from a plane crash in Brazil. There's 2 people who are flying the plane. Cavites, the co-pilot, who's local, and then there's Klotz, who's German, and he's the big fancy super main pilot. So Cavites, he's recognised the fact that there's poor visibility, they don't know where the runway is, and they have actually almost run out of fuel, and he says to Klotz, tell them we are in an emergency. Klotz says to the control tower, that's right, to 180 on the heading, and we'll try once again. We're running out of fuel. So what actually happened here is the control tower didn't think that this was too crucial and worrying. They let another plane land, and they said, look, just go round again and have another look. When they went round again, they ran out of fuel and crashed into a mountain. Anyone ever heard anything like this before? Rob, 3 in the morning, trying to put a tube in, can't. Says to the junior person, quick, ring the boss, tell him I can't intubate or ventilate and I need him now. Very junior person, very worried about ringing the big scary boss. Morning, sorry to bother you. Hey, how you going? You busy? Yep. Oh, are you? Yep, I'll wake you up. Sorry about that. Yep, no. Look, Rob's having a little bit of trouble managing the airway. Do you reckon you can come and give us a hand if it's not too much trouble, if you're available? Imagine what that's like to receive that phone call versus the one that says, Dave, Rob can't tube the patient, can't ventilate, and we need you in the next 3 seconds, preferably 15 seconds ago. You're out of bed, you're in the car, you're away. We've all got to watch mitigated speech. We all do it. Alrighty, back to popular science literature again. This is a great book, Deep Survival by Lawrence Gonzalez. Lawrence Gonzalez is an author from America, and Deep Survival is another collection of vignettes all about people who have been on the edge of survival. And he tries to paint the picture of what makes the ones get through and live, and what happens to the people who don't make it. So one of the chapters talks about Lawrence Gonzalez doing an embedded period of time on one of the huge American aircraft carriers, the USS Carl Vinson. Lawrence Gonzalez is a pilot as well as a journalist, and he gets flying, and he also knows that to be a carrier pilot you need to be selected from the best of the best fighter pilots in the USAF, and then you need to prove that you can do the job after a huge amount of training by doing a night carrier landing. And a carrier landing at night is generally acknowledged to be the most difficult aviation feat. You've got about 100 meters of runway lit up sparsely to try and avoid being an enemy target. You have approach speeds incredibly fast. You've got a deck which pitches and rolls depending on the ocean conditions and wind, and you have to land your plane and snag a large hook on a massive hydraulic cable, or else you're in deep poo. If you come in too fast and hard, you'll probably miss the cable and shoot off the end of the deck into the water. If you come in low and slow, you'll probably hit the back of the carrier or thump down hard and destroy your plane, if not yourself. So these guys obviously take a lot to build up to doing this night carrier landing. They get a lot of help to do it. They have the most sophisticated aircraft guidance system in the world. They've got a 3D night vision heads-up display in their monitor. They've got a huge amount of sensory input with their flight speed, altitude, etc., etc., giving them all the information they need. That gives them all the information in real time, and it has a series of different warnings and alarms which tell them if they're at the wrong speed, wrong altitude, wrong angle of descent, etc. But not only that, to give them a human side to this, in their ear they've got an incredibly experienced pilot teacher who sits out actually on this little almost veranda off the side of the bridge, literally putting himself in harm's way, and he gives them that sort of calm sensory input, saying, look mate, you're a little bit low, etc. Why don't you turn around and have another go? So he stands out there and watches these guys and girls come in to do their landing, and is the final arbiter of whether they get to land. So in this instance, when Lawrence Gonzalez is standing here with this bloke, they're watching a guy come in, and it's fairly obvious quite a long way out that he's low and slow. So his approach is too low and he's not got enough speed. So not only is his heads-up display and the instruments all telling him that he needs to power up, go around, have another go, but the bloke who's standing out on the deck is saying, yep, you need to have another crack at this, mate. Despite those sort of inputs that he's getting, he keeps coming. So the level of the alarm starts getting raised. He starts getting very loud noises. He gets red flashy lights, and instead of being nice and calm, the guy on the bridge starts saying, turn around, power up, turn around, very directly. He gets closer and closer, and it's very clear that despite all of the input now in sort of panic mode, including the guy on the deck who's really worried that he's going to get hit as well, this bloke is going to land no matter what. And they start doing their evacuation procedure where they get all the guys off the deck, and eventually the pilot comes in, dumps the plane into the back of the USS Carl Vinson, destroys $35 million worth of F-18 Hornet, but thankfully lives to fight another day, although he doesn't continue on as a carrier pilot. So the next slide, I've got a video of a carrier landing. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of this pilot coming in to try and land this plane. I want you to think about situations that you've been in critical care where you feel like this carrier pilot. You've got an extremely difficult task and you're struggling to keep your emotions at bay.
that was the end of the pilot training for this particular pilot, and was the end of that aeroplane. Thankfully, everyone survived. There was a lot of damage. How could this possibly happen, though? We just talked about this person being extremely highly trained, the best of the best. They've got all this information. They're being told very early on that the descent angle's wrong, and they've got a nice bloke in their ear saying, you know, you should stop, and then screaming at them, hey, pull up, get out, fire up, go away. They've got red buttons, lights, noises screaming at them, and despite all of that information, they persist in trying to land. What's happened? Well, the reality is this person has been overcome by fear, and the amygdala, that's the, you know, the little part of the brain that spits out all that adrenaline, has been activated. They have locked on to this sense that safety equals home, which provides a familiar, emotional and happy feeling. They've never had a situation where a landing has gone bad. These are the best pilots in the world. Every time that plane lands, they stop, they get out safely, everything is hunky-dory. So the runway equals good, the air equals scary, the dark equals bad. They were unable to drag themselves away from the goal despite every other sensory input telling him to abort. There has been no emotional experience of landing slow because it's never happened before. So he's got nothing to compare this descent to. And there's this corollary that people use, the horse and the jockey. So, you know, the jockey can control the horse sometimes, but if the horse or the adrenaline decides it's going to go, well, the jockey's along for the ride. And so the emotion has taken over from the cognition. They always say takeoff is optional, but landing is mandatory. What's the clinical corollary of this? Well, everyone who's been in critical care for a while has seen an airway go wrong. Everyone has seen probably someone get locked into the tube must go in situation. I myself did it when I was quite junior, and what an experience it was. Thank God everything turned out okay, but I completely get this whole total body emotional overload that happens. You are absolutely fixated on putting the tube through the cords, despite you can see the SATs, you can hear your colleagues saying stop and bag, but you just want that tube in. That's the familiar, that's the safety, that gives you the happy feeling, yay, the tube's in. When what you need to be able to do is separate yourself from the emotion and think very, very clearly. So it's really important to understand this happen, and I guess I was lucky in some respects that my experience happened when I was very junior, that the outcome wasn't bad, and so that I was absolutely able to learn from it, and I've become very familiar with that feeling. And I've never pushed beyond the start of that feeling ever again in my career, which has been great because I've been able to avoid getting trapped into the vortex of bad decision making that happens when you're emotionally overloaded. One of the other chapters in Deep Survival tells a story of an Army Ranger. Now, Army Rangers are like other special forces soldiers in the rest of the world in that they are known to be super, mega, amazingly fit and tough. The selection process is arduous, and there really is a take-no-prisoners attitude. In fact, for this Army Ranger, his selection process involved being dropped on one side of a massive wilderness area, given only a Bowie knife and an EPIRB, and told that he was to meet his commanding officers on the other side of this wilderness area in 1 week's time. It involved trekking something like 200 kilometres over rivers, mountains, dense forest, and activation of the EPIRB, which led to your rescue, meant that you were not selected as an Army Ranger. So you can see that this fellow is pretty independent, pretty fit, pretty strong. He's having some time off, he's on holidays, he visits a national park, and he decides he wants to go whitewater rafting. So next slide's going to show a video of someone going whitewater rafting, similar to this guy. I want you to watch this video, and again, see how this situation makes you feel. And I guess depending on your level of experience with water or whitewater rafting or rivers, you may feel varying levels of emotion.
Okay. Sorry, can you get a back paddle? Keep going. Back paddle hard! Back paddle!
What happened next? Well, he got thrown a rope from the boat, but he was having a nice time floating on his back, and he didn't feel scared at all. So he said, put his hand up there, don't worry guys, all fine, see you in a bit, I'll just get myself to the side, you pick me up further down. Didn't really understand rivers very well. He didn't know that over the next rapid was one of those recirculator hole things that can hold down, an elephant if it wanted to. And so about 20 seconds later he was sucked over the next rapid and put into a recirculator and drowned. So how could this possibly happen? I mean, this is one of the fittest, highest trained dudes in the entire world. Well, he's very well trained, but the training emphasises independence. Remember, he'd crossed a whole state of America by himself in a week, didn't need to ask anyone for help. So when that rope came to him, he was like, fine, don't need it. The other thing is his normal sort of fear response, and anyone who's been whitewater rafting fell out would recognise there's usually a fairly significant one, and your other sympathetic responses are blunted by years of training in other dangerous environments. So when you're being shot at by the Taliban, having mortar fire, jumping out of helicopters, a little bit of gently flowing river doesn't do a lot to trigger your normal protective survival responses. He evaluated his risk and he felt safe, but he was unfamiliar with the environment, and that led to overconfidence. Probably there was also a fear of failure. I mean, this guy, failure is never an option, so accepting help from the rope is like saying, I couldn't do it, I needed help. Anyone got a clinical situation that they've been involved in where this has happened? And this is probably the scenario that happens more likely towards the end of training, particularly ED training. You're done well. You're almost a specialist, or you are a specialist. You've been able to do all sorts of things throughout your career. Everything's gone pretty well. That fear response that I talked about earlier, you've been able to keep that under wraps, and you have to keep it under wraps, but you've blunted it so you don't get scared anymore. You get an airway or a patient that superficially looks probably a bit like something you've done before, but when you start moving forward you realise that it's not quite the same. Something's different about this, but you push on nevertheless, and you get yourself buried in a very, very deep hole that's hard to get out of. It's important that overconfidence doesn't come in to medicine. We like to talk about the competence and confidence scale, and we'd always like our competence to be greater than our confidence, but both need to be relatively well advanced in order to do a good job in critical care. So, summary of this section. There's a lot of emotional and cultural factors which have a large impact on our decisions, particularly in pressurized environments. We need to learn about the different error types and how prone we are to them, and we need to learn to self-evaluate and recognize how prone we are to these error types in order to help avoid errors. So, I will see you in the next talk where we do the final part of decisions and errors, and we'll talk about how do we avoid errors in medicine. Thanks very much. Again, any questions, feel free to write me a question. I'll endeavour to get back to you as soon as I can.